Hello and welcome to this, our second video in a 5-part series about pastoral care post-pandemic. We made the videos because we're fully aware, as you will be, that social and emotional needs are going to be escalating even as we speak. I don't know who said this, but it's a great quote that we're all in the same storm, the COVID storm, but we're certainly not in the same boat. And we do know that the most disadvantaged children are going to be the ones most acutely impacted by what's happened during their time out of school. So we need to be ready for them. And in the view of the local authority, being ready means being trauma informed. Just a quick reminder here about what we're covering through the series. So today's focus is on how to create a therapeutic school environment which will optimise pupils' healing. I want to spend just a little bit of time exploring a key concept in the trauma field, which is social buffering. Basically, your therapeutic school community is the one that does buffer children against traumatic or adverse experiences. And this can explain the difference between pupils' responses to events that happen in their lives. So, for example, pupil X is acting out his distress in a way that's getting him into a lot of trouble. Pupil Y has experienced even worse adversity outside of school and yet is going with the programme, is not challenging our systems. Now, there's a temptation sometimes to therefore conclude that pupil X is making wrong choices. However, that ignores everything we know about protective factors and about, in this context, social buffering. So, and I referred to this in the previous video, the higher quality relationships that a pupil has, the more able they are to cope with adverse, stressful, traumatic life events. And actually, when we think about it, there's a lot of common sense in that idea. Through our relationships, we're able to process things that happen to us. We're able to move on. We're able to keep things in perspective. Dr. Bruce Perry refers to this as habituation. He says that our brains know what to do when we're distressed. So when really tough things happen to us, we go straight to somebody that we are close to, don't we? And we share it. I know when my mum died, my brother and I spent weeks and weeks just talking about her. And through talking, we habituate experiences that would otherwise risk becoming toxic. And we do see this thing in school, which is block grief. Some children acting out their grief rather than talking it through, perhaps because they don't have anybody to talk it through with, or perhaps they don't have the language for that sort of discourse. That's why you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. You just have to be an adult who's prepared to listen with empathy, with understanding, with compassion. It's about being fully present for a child when perhaps those fully present empathic ears aren't available to them anywhere else in life. Another really important concept is therapeutic dosing. So I've referred really to our longer conversations, but we do know from research that you can really help a child recover and stabilise through chance encounters that are kind and regular through the day. Your hellos, your how was your weekend, those personal touches have an accumulative effect and they do stabilise children. They do allow them actually to develop new ways of relating to people. New connections are made in the brain. They learn to trust. They learn to do relationships through these positive experiences with a range of people. And that's why it's so important that trauma-informed practice is a whole school thing, because everybody has a part to play in this process, from cleaner to site manager to head teacher. Anybody can contribute to this really important process, which we know as therapeutic dosing. Now that sounds all very straightforward, all very doable. And one might assume that it would happen naturally because relationships are natural. Of course, we relate to children, that's why we're teachers. We're also a deeply social species. Our very survival depended on our belonging to a clan, on our making connections back in the day. So we shouldn't really have to plan for relationships, but we do, because we know that the children who need relationships the most don't tend to have enough relational support in schools, and that's because they push us away. It also links with the notion of mirror neurons. So, mirror neurons mean that we mirror back the way that people present to us. So, if people are hostile, then we are naturally hostile back. And so, teachers are not going to be naturally drawn to children who are not good at relationships, who push them back. And that's something that we've got to deliberately and strategically counteract. So, one way is to ensure all the staff get this, that they're trauma informed, that they do know that they need to take that bit of time, that they need to accept the apology, that they need to start again every lesson, that nothing is personal. They need to do the deliberate meet and greet for the pupils that perhaps they will wish, might have had another day off. All of those things, very important. But also with these really vulnerable, relationally poor children, they need a deeper, longer lasting relationship as well if they're going to feel safe and if they're going to develop that network in the brain around how is it that we make relationships. And it's worth thinking about the transition from primary to secondary here as well, because that is really problematic for children impacted by trauma. So at primary, they have got the safety of that relationship, that really strong relationship with the class teacher. They're very well known, they're understood. Transition to secondary though, and suddenly there are 6, 7, 8 adults in a day that they've got to manage, and that doesn't feel so safe. That is potentially quite triggering for some. And the way to counteract that is to think in terms of key adult support. So it's identifying the children who need to build a positive long-term relationship with somebody and linking those up for the long term. And if you think about it, schools are rich in this sort of resource because we're not talking, remember, about therapists or counsellors. So when I was at school, I had a key adult scheme and I used, for example, a lab technician with one pupil. I used the finance manager with another, and they were both absolutely great at building these relationships, of sustaining them, of getting to know the families as well. And that was really reassuring for all of our sort of high risk families that they had that person in school who completely understood the situation, who got it, and who would, if you like, be an understanding advocate. So it's about being creative with the resource that you've got and just being confident that, yeah, this person might not have a degree in psychology or they might not be a level 3 counsellor, but actually that doesn't matter. So long as they're warm, compassionate, attuned, and unconditional in their positive regard for the person, then they'll perform a really essential therapeutic service. When key adult support doesn't seem to be making any difference, it could be that it just needs more time, but it could be that there's something going on with the therapeutic alliance or not going on. It could be that you just have two incompatible personalities together. And to avoid this, it's important to listen to the voice of the child from the outset because they'll know who they want to speak to, who they don't want to speak to. And it's also important to honour the fact that they may not want to speak about personal stuff or about problems. But that's not a reason for not talking at all. And what's helpful here is, of course, the solutions focused approach, which we've gone large on in Lincolnshire. This is a methodology that means that you can spend all of your time with a child talking not about the problem, and there's a risk that you grow the problem by focusing on it, but by talking about the solution, by discussing what's gone well that day. So it's tricky in school. Behaviour is problematic for you, but when did it go well? When would you have normally not lost your temper, but you didn't lose your temper? What was going on then? These are typical solutions focused questions. And the coach might set a task between meetings, something like, tell you what, look out for what's going well over the next week, and let's talk about that when you come back to me. So, very helpful way of, if you like, structuring key adult support. Structured kindness is what Dr. Jeff James likes to call it. And if you're interested in training your key adults up in solutions focused conversations, then do get in touch, because we do have a free coach's guide available for Lincolnshire schools. Really powerful process. Schools that place wellbeing front and centre, in other words, therapeutic schools, they'll want their community to know that. So visible signs like the worry box in the form room or the worry inbox are important in terms of that messaging. It's reassuring for young people to know that they're not just their grades, that they do matter as individuals, because they can be a little bit cynical about that sometimes. It's also important to consider screening, because of course we value what we measure and we measure what we value. So if we're really serious about this work, then we will want to know for sure who needs us and how we might be able to help. And I guess I've concentrated so far really on those young people who act out their distress, who are known to us. But we do know that there are many children who suffer silently, and it's important that we find them out so that they can be given the best possible support. Of course, there are 3 key survival strategies: fight, flight, freeze. So we know about the children who fight, and we know about the ones who go into flight. But the frozen children are often invisible, because that's the whole modus operandi, isn't it? To be hidden, to survive a frightening world by retreating from it, by not being noticed. This links closely with the idea of dissociation. So that's a process which enables people to survive, for example, sexual abuse. They will go somewhere else in the mind. It's almost like an out-of-body experience, which takes a person away from the pain to a safe place, far, far away. And what we know is that some children actually spend a lot of their lives in that place far away if they're traumatized. They might present in school as being in a dream or a daze, or perhaps a little bit rude, the children who don't listen well to us, who don't engage, who don't get the work done because they haven't heard it. In order to feel safe, in order to participate fully in life, in education, then these children need relational support as well, because it's the relationship that provides that essential feeling of safety, that sense of belonging that is so critical in this work. And we may need things like wellbeing screens, worry boxes, all of those ways of identifying these children who aren't necessarily going to come to our attention otherwise, but who are desperately in need of us. I wanted to say just a little bit about extracurricular activities, because they're such a fantastic way of building positive relationships with young people. We can, as teachers, be that bit more informal. There's more banter, there's more laughter. The power dynamic is a little bit different when we're outside of the classroom. And lots of us have experienced going on a school trip, coming back and feeling that sort of special bond with the children that we felt that we spent that time with. But again, we need to be strategic about this, because it's a regrettable fact that actually the most disadvantaged children don't participate in this element of school life, this critical element. There's a report from the Social Mobility Commission called An Unequal Playing Field, which makes that very point. And it's something that we need to try to change, because Remember, relational poverty is the enemy, and extracurricular activities are an unbeatable way of creating relational wealth and that sense of belonging. That's why denying somebody an experience of this sort is exactly the wrong type of consequence that we should be thinking of. And I have seen occasions where, a child is not behaving in maths and therefore they can't play for the school football team. That's something that we really need to review. Clearly, there are times when we need consequences, but it's very important to ensure that the consequence isn't entirely counterproductive. If the consequence weakens the ties that bind, then it's a bad consequence. The other big advantage of the extra activity, the club at lunchtime, is of course the fact that it provides structure during what would otherwise be an unstructured period of time. We know lack of structure can be very difficult for traumatized children to cope with. They need things to be predictable, to be routine in order to feel safe. So there's lots of sensory stimulation on your average schoolyard, lots going on, lots that's potentially triggering, and we do see incidents then. So if we can redirect our most vulnerable young people into positive extracurricular activities, then that is going to be incredibly helpful. I look much more closely at discipline in videos 4 and 5, but I did just want to flag here that trauma-informed practice is definitely not about simply forming great relationships with vulnerable young people, playing football with them at lunchtime, and then letting them do what they like in lessons. It is absolutely about enforcing boundaries, providing routine, structure, supervision, all of those things. And that's one hand of discipline, referring here to Kim Golding's take on it. The other hand, though, is the one that offers connection and warmth and nurture. And we need both within our relationships and we need both within our schools. We need to find a relational way of doing discipline. And Kim Golding writes brilliantly about this, and I will explore that later. But important to flag, I guess, that trauma-informed practice is absolutely about high standards, but it's not high standards that sacrifice emotional well-being. To conclude, the therapeutic school is the one that invests in relationships, that deliberately and strategically creates relational wealth, especially where there is poverty. It's the school that understands the truth of this fantastic quote from Dr. Perry, which is that the more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely he will be to recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love.